Before we begin today's story, take a moment to subscribe if you enjoy emotionally driven stories that linger with you long after the video ends. These are the kinds of stories that aren't loud or rushed, but quietly settle into your heart. And if you stay until the end, you might find yourself thinking about this one longer than you expect. The evening began like many others in the quiet Oregon town where Margaret Lewis had lived for most of her adult life. Everything seemed calm on the surface, steady in rhythm, wrapped in the soft colors of early fall. But beneath that calm, something unseen was already moving. Something that would soon change the shape of her world. Margaret was 51, a widow of 6 years, and a woman who carried her life with quiet strength. She woke early each morning, worked at the local library, cooked simple dinners, and found comfort in routines that had helped her survive loss. On that particular evening, she stood near the living room window watching dry leaves slide across the sidewalk while the sky faded into pale gray. She was thinking of nothing important, simply enjoying the stillness. Then she heard the front door open. It was later than usual. Without knowing why, she felt a subtle shift in the air, as if the calm of the evening had quietly ended. Her son Ethan stepped inside. He was tall, thoughtful, his jacket half-zipped, moving quickly as though he wanted the moment to pass unnoticed. He smiled at her, but the smile felt practiced, then not the easy smile she knew. Margaret noticed it instantly, because mothers always do. Especially mothers who raised a child alone through grief and growth. She had taught Ethan values not through lectures, but through patience, presence, and quiet example. Ethan had returned home only 3 months earlier after finishing college. He said he needed time to figure out his next step, and Margaret had welcomed him without hesitation. She was proud of the man he had become, polite, gentle, careful with words. But that night something in his eyes looked unsettled, as if he were carrying a thought too heavy to speak. When Margaret asked how his day had been, Ethan answered quickly, "Fine." Then he moved toward the stairs before she could ask anything else. The silence he left behind felt sharper than his words. Margaret told herself not to overthink it. Young adults change, she reminded herself. Distance is natural. But as she turned back toward the window, a memory surfaced unexpectedly. Something her late husband once told her many years ago. Intuition is often truth knocking softly. A small ache formed in her chest. Not fear. Not anger. Just the quiet awareness that something important was beginning. Over the next few days, that feeling only grew stronger as small details refused to fit together. Ethan spent more time on his phone. He stepped outside to take calls. Sometimes Margaret heard him laughing softly, only for the laughter to fade the moment she entered the room. Margaret respected privacy. She never believed in spying or questioning every action. Still, she couldn't ignore the way her life suddenly felt slightly tilted, as if the ground beneath her had begun to shift. On Wednesday afternoon, while organizing returned books at the library, Margaret received a phone call from her closest friend, Clare Bennett. They had known each other for over a decade. But the moment Margaret heard Clare's voice, she felt something was wrong. It carried a tension she had never heard before. Tight, careful, like someone choosing each word with painful precision. Clare asked if they could meet later that evening. "Just to talk," she said. Margaret agreed immediately, unaware that this simple meeting would unravel a truth she never expected. They met at a small cafe near the river. A quiet place they had visited many times before. Soft music played in the background while low conversations filled the room. Clare had arrived early. Her coffee sat untouched. Her hands were folded tightly together, as if holding herself still. When Margaret sat down, she immediately noticed how Clare avoided eye contact. Her shoulders were tense. Before Margaret could even ask what was wrong, Clare took a slow breath. Then she spoke. "I need to be honest with you," she said quietly. "Not because I want to be, but because not being honest is hurting everyone." The words came slowly, carefully. Clare explained that over the past few weeks, Ethan had started talking to her more often. At first the conversations seemed harmless. They talked about life, about grief, about feeling lost after big changes. It felt supportive, almost comforting. But slowly, those conversations had begun to shift. What started as understanding had turned into something heavier, something emotional, something that made Clare deeply uncomfortable. Margaret listened without interrupting. Her face remained calm, but her mind raced. She struggled to understand how two people she trusted completely could have stepped into such fragile territory. Clare insisted nothing inappropriate had happened. The moment she realized the conversations were crossing emotional boundaries, she stopped them. But before that happened, Ethan had confessed something. Feelings he didn't fully understand. That confession alone shattered something inside Margaret. Not because of romance, but because of what it meant. The line it crossed. The trust it bent. A heavy silence settled between the two women at the table. Margaret felt the moment land slowly inside her chest, like thick fog spreading through her thoughts. The pain she felt wasn't jealousy. It wasn't anger either. It was grief. The days after that evening moved strangely for Margaret. Not with dramatic events, but with quiet emotions that seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. Time felt faster somehow, as if the world had continued moving while she struggled to keep her balance. The house that had once felt warm and peaceful now felt careful. Every word was measured. Every silence carried meaning. Ethan remained polite, present, even helpful around the house. Yet there was a distance in him that Margaret could feel even when they were sitting in the same room. It was the kind of distance that appears when two people know something important has happened, but neither has yet found the right words to face it. Margaret sensed he was waiting for her to speak first, waiting for her to name the truth that both of them were already carrying. But she needed clarity before confronting him. So the next afternoon she reached out to Clare again. This time Margaret asked for complete honesty. Not gentle explanations. Not careful protection of feelings. Just the truth. They met again at the same small cafe near the river. Clare looked exhausted, as though she had been carrying guilt that refused to rest. When Margaret arrived, Clare didn't waste time trying to soften the conversation. She spoke openly. She explained how the bond between her and Ethan had formed slowly. At first it had simply been conversations. Long talks about life, about uncertainty, about the strange loneliness people feel when standing between one stage of life and another. Ethan had just finished college and was unsure of his future. Clare was rebuilding her life after a difficult divorce. Two people feeling lost had found comfort in simply being heard. At first, nothing about it seemed unusual. But comfort, when shared often enough, can quietly grow into something deeper. Clare admitted that she began to feel valued in those conversations, seen in a way she hadn't felt for a long time. And Ethan, searching for direction, found someone who listened without judgment. The connection deepened before either of them fully noticed. Margaret listened carefully, her expression calm even as 1,000 thoughts moved through her mind. Because what she was hearing wasn't a story of betrayal in the usual sense. It was something more complicated. Two people who had allowed loneliness to guide their emotions further than wisdom should have allowed. Clare's voice softened as she continued. The moment she realized the conversations were turning into emotional attachment, she stopped them immediately. She told Ethan clearly that the situation had crossed a line that should never have been approached. And Ethan, shocked by his own feelings, admitted he hadn't even realized how far things had gone until she said it out loud. Margaret felt a deep sadness while listening. Not anger. Not resentment. Just a quiet understanding of how easily good intentions can drift into dangerous places when boundaries are left unspoken. Because some lines in life are invisible, but they exist for a reason. And once crossed, even gently, they leave marks. When Margaret returned home later that evening, she knew she could no longer delay the conversation with Ethan. Silence had begun to feel like permission. She stepped into the backyard where Ethan stood looking up at the darkening sky, his hands resting on the wooden fence. When she called his name, he turned slowly. He already knew why she had come. Margaret walked closer, her voice calm but firm. "I know everything," she said. There was no accusation in her tone. No anger. Just honesty that left no room for denial. Ethan's shoulders dropped slightly as if a weight he had been carrying was suddenly too heavy to hold any longer. Words began pouring out of him quickly. He explained that he never planned for feelings to grow. That after college he felt lost in ways he didn't know how to explain.